Okay, here we are, ready to start our, I think we're on lecture 18 at this point. Ooh, there's a buzz here, Don, a loud buzz, and it's getting louder and louder and louder. Is it Gary? Gary, are you there? I can see you. I can just see your hand. I can't see all of you. Okay, how about Jonathan? Are you there, Jonathan? Gary, if you could try to answer us, maybe the buzz is coming from your green site.
Hello, Dr. Bowman.
Woo, woo, that was it. Okay. Good, Gary. Last week, what happened to you? We lost you. Couldn't they
no idea.
Start up the site? Okay. Okay. All right, good. And I guess Jonathan's not there, although we have his full color picture of the empty room. All right. Okay. But Gary, we're glad you're there.
Can you see me now?
Yeah. Can see you now. Did I hear Jonathan say something? No. Don't hear Jonathan saying anything. Okay. Tonight, just to touch base to show where we are right now, we have two lectures essentially. We're going to do the Albigensian Crusade, which you had a reading, the Song of the Cathar Wars, to read a history of the Albigensian Crusades, and this is again one of your adventure novels, and I'll ask you what you all thought of it, and we'll go through the whole routine of the wars and see what you thought about it. Okay, and that'll be for the first hour and a half tonight, our first lecture. I put this on the website and it ran to quite a number of pages, so I may not finish the Albigensian Crusade in the first hour and a half, and so we may continue in the second half, depending on how, I don't want to rush it. So we may continue into the second half. The second half of tonight, which will be lecture 19, will be on St. Louis Crusades and Frederick II and the Crusader States, and also the Fifth Crusade, which actually happens before St. Louis Crusade. I did not get that on the website in time for all of you who are here in the studio tonight, and I thought about it at 4 o'clock. I thought I need to load this on the website, and then I forgot. So I apologize deeply to you all. I'll put it on right after class tonight, and so you'll have the notes. But you can look at the monitor like the students at home who are watching this on tape will be watching it. Well, if they download the notes will be on there for them when they see it. Okay, so I'm sorry you're at a little bit of a disadvantage, but the good part is it's kind of a shorter lecture, so there's not nearly as much information in it for you to take notes. Okay, and then next week we're going to kind of wind up all our formal lectures on the Crusades. Next week we're going to talk about the Crusade in Spain, and I've sort of alluded to that from time to time, but I haven't gone through just the entire process of the Crusades in Spain. And we have these strange crusades in Italy that are political crusades. We'll take a look at those, looking at a kind of winding up of the Crusades or winding down. No, it depends on how you want to look at it as the Crusades end. And then we'll look at what is happening to the Muslim world in the Middle East. And of course the Muslims are either driven out of or absorbed into Spain, but in the Middle East they change radically, and that's because two groups arise. First, the Mamluks, who are outside invaders who come in and essentially conquer the Muslim world, and then another group of even farther outsiders, the Mongols, come and conquer the Muslim world. And so that's kind of how the Crusades end up in the Muslim world from that point of view. So we'll look at that, and we'll speculate about, and we'll also look at the Crusades in America. And I'm calling the conquest of the Americas a crusade, and I'll get into more of that when we talk about the fall of Mexico and the fall of Peru to the Spanish conquistadores. They're just crusaders with another label. And I think they're exactly like the Crusaders. But we'll look at the story and we'll see if you all agree. If that's the phenomenon, if the crusading mentality is what, in essence, caused the Europeans to create an empire. And it's a really interesting question that we can look at. And so we'll do that kind of at the end next time. Okay, now we're going to look at the Albigensian Crusade. And I want to do a little bit of review. We looked at the Fourth Crusade last time, and here is the city of Byzantium that you can see looking across the Bosporus. And when we left it with the end of the Fourth Crusade, it was now the Latin Empire, and so the Europeans have control of the Byzantine Empire, at least temporarily. It only lasted about 60 years, but they did get control of it temporarily. And so we looked at that last time. And, sorry, my pages are sticking together. Here is a nice picture of Santa Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, or Hagia Sophia in Greek, the Church of Holy Wisdom, which is one of the grandest monuments to the Byzantine Empire that still survives to this day. And we also looked last time at the Northern Crusades and the military orders. And I had forgotten I owned this book. It's a one. Oh, I meant to bring that book tonight. I didn't bring it. It's a wonderful book that was written in 1888, and it's a history of all the Catholic dioceses in Germany. And it has these wonderful paintings in it that they're not medieval, but they capture the spirit of the Middle Ages. I think they're done in the medieval style. They kind of copy the the medieval style. And so here you can see like the German countryside, which of course isn't anything like the Holy Land. I mean, in the winter there's ice and snow, and in the summer it's not terribly hot. I mean, it's rather temperate in that area of Germany where the Crusades went on. One of the things you're going to see in all of these pictures is the prominence of the Virgin Mary, and so remember that one of the excuses that the knights, the Teutonic knights, made for conquering the pagan lands was that Livonia was the dowry of the Virgin. And so the Virgin is just really predominant in all of the literature that we have about the Teutonic Knights, and so you'll see a little bit of this. Here is an interesting picture that shows the mentality of the Teutonic Knights in Germany. This is the Archdiocese of Munich and Freising, and you might think this is St. George, but it's not. It's actually St. Michael, who I've never thought of as a knightly kind of angel, but here he is slaying a devil. And so this picks up the mood of the Teutonic Knights. And here is the Mary Church at Schönenberg, and again, this is just like the churches they built all over the northern Baltic lands, and again the Virgin is predominant over it, and you can see the forested northern lands. This is quite an interesting one. We have the church down here at the bottom, but at the top is the Virgin in a tree. Does that strike anybody as interesting? Do you know anything about your German history, or why they would show the Virgin in a tree and what that symbolizes here? But
it's the Christmas tree.
Okay, a Christmas tree. That's not a Christmas tree exactly, but it's a tree. Yeah, right, we did. And the reason is because most of the pagans in Northern Europe, in Germany and Scandinavia, before they became Christians, they worshipped trees. And so groves of trees or individual trees, like the major, the Scandinavians conceived of the whole universe as a great ash tree, with everything that was living, everything that was part of the world was somehow connected to that ash tree, either its branches or its trunk or its roots, and it encompassed the entire world. Okay, so here, now the symbolism here is they're showing this Virgin in a sacred tree, which is building on the heritage of Germany, which I think is quite interesting that this lasted until 1888, that they're still using this symbolism here in this story of Germany. And here again are the churches that they built. These are Romanesque churches. This is Trier. This is where they would have actually set out on the crusade, and here's a little crusader banner hanging from this church. Here's the Rhine River, and this is on the River Rhine, and so this is the more settled part of Germany, but these are very typical castles on top of mountains that are still typical in Germany and were there, and that's where the Teutonic Knights came from, and that's where they set out to do their invading. And here indeed are some crusaders. And how do we know they're crusaders?
The cross on the shoulder.
Okay, good. They've got crosses all over them. He's got a cross on his shoulder. He's got little crosses on the banners on him. His horse has crosses. He's followed by some monks that have crosses and are carrying crosses. And here they are in their armor, the knights that are going on crusade. Yeah, okay, they've got crosses. And here are some more crusaders. These are a little more obvious crusaders. You can see the crosses on their shields and the crosses on their banners, and here he's got a cross on his chest. These are clearly crusaders setting out from the cathedral at Spire, and this is a pretty accurate rendition of that cathedral, and they're being led by a bishop on crusade. So that's pretty clear here that here are crusaders. And here they are. Here are monks encountering Christ and having a vision as they're Christianizing the northern lands. And here they are now. Once they Christianize the northern lands, they build churches and cathedrals, and then they set up the same kind of organization that they're familiar with in Germany, and they're recreating it in these pagan lands. And this is at Breslau, and here is another example of that at Cologne. And Cologne, of course, is one of the older parts of Germany. It wouldn't have been the native parts. One of the interesting things is that, does anybody know the sort of rough religious configuration of Germany today?
Lutheran?
Only part of it is Lutheran. What do you know about?
I was going to say the northern part is primarily Lutheran, the southern part is primarily Catholic.
Good, excellent. Okay, yeah. And so what does that mean? That means that the older part of Germany is Catholic, the part that was Christianized first and was Catholic for a long time, and the newly conquered areas that the Crusaders went to became Lutheran, because the northern part of Germany is Lutheran. So isn't that interesting? It didn't quite stick, did it? As well as the southern part did. And so Cologne is the older part of Germany that would have been Christianized a long time before the northern part. Well, we looked at the Northern Crusades, and we looked at the military orders and their development, and of course here are the Templars with these two horses as brothers, two men on a horse as brothers going out to protect the Holy Land and building themselves up into a gigantic and wealthy order. And I found this picture, knights doing penance at a shrine, that I thought kind of symbolized the end of the Templars when Philip the Fair actually sort of confiscated everything and took what he wanted and kept what he wanted. Well, the military orders are a divergence from the crusading mission in a way. I mean, the military orders were doing what the Crusaders, what the initial crusade wanted to do, which is to convert people and to protect the Holy Land and to sort of militarize the Christian mentality. Yeah, comment, Matthew.
I thought you said that the First Crusade was not a mission to convert the heathen.
Right, it wasn't. It wasn't. The First Crusade was to reconquer the Holy Land. It was not to convert. But the military orders represent the militarization of society. Would you agree with that? That really, the Crusades represent a militarization of that society, or at least the society was already military. We might say a legitimization of the militariness of that society. And so it permeates everything in the military orders. And so what's happening is the concept of crusade is broadening, okay, so that in addition to reconquering the Holy Land, now they're converting the pagans in the northern part of Europe, and it gets worse or better, depending on your point of view, as we then look at areas of France that the Pope decides are populated by heretics. Okay, the Pope makes the decision that southern France is populated by heretics, and so Innocent III calls a crusade against southern France. Now, this is quite interesting. This represents a broadening of the idea and an extending of the idea of crusade, and one might even question whether it's a legitimate extension of the idea of crusade. I mean, are you going to do it inside Europe? Well, maybe, maybe not. Let me describe some of the Albigensians to you. You already know a little bit about them. And then we'll talk about, what kind of a crusade this is. So Innocent III represents a turning point and also the height of the crusading movement. He's, in fact, a turning point in European history. He represents the summit of the medieval papacy, and as we said last time, he initiated about 7 crusades in various areas of the world. The Albigensian crusade comes really right after the 4th crusade. The Albigensian crusade lasted from 1208 to 1226. He also called the Livonian crusade in the Baltic, led by Albert of Buxtehude. And he called a crusade against Marquard of Anweiler, another Saladin in Sicily, who we'll talk about next time. In 1199, after the death of Queen Constance of Sicily and the Emperor Henry VI, 3-year-old Frederick II was the heir. The German Marquard of Anweiler gained strength and as an advisor to the royal court in Sicily, and Innocent rallied a tiny crusade of Frenchmen against him. And in fact, what Innocent did was to check Marquard's power. When he died in 1202, no one could really take his place. And so we have this little crusade being fought in southern Italy for purely political reasons, just for papal control of southern Italy. Innocent also called the Spanish Crusade and the Children's Crusade. We said he didn't really call that. It happened rather spontaneously. Innocent III also was kind of campaigning against England. King John of England, who was the successor of Richard Lionheart, actually lost his lands in France. He was the vassal of the King of France in theory, and the King of France, Philip Augustus, was able to impose his lordship on King John. And he did this in a really interesting way. King John actually went to France and he stole away the bride of, I can't remember the guy's name, something the Brown. I'm thinking Philip the Brown. I'm not sure if it's Philip or not, but Hugh the Brown. Hugh the Brown was a vassal of King Philip of France, and John stole his fiancée away and married her. And so Philip Augustus, the King of France, called John to his court and said, John, you are my vassal because you are the Duke of Normandy and you hold Normandy from me. And so I demand that you do penance for stealing Hugh the Brown's bride and make restitution to him. And John replied, I am a king. I am no one's vassal, and I'm not coming to your court and as a feudal vassal. And so Philip Augustus said, but you hold Normandy from me as a feudal vassal, and since you will not obey your lord, then I will disseize you of Normandy and I take it back into my own hands. And so he actually took back Normandy and Brittany and Anjou, and he sent an army into Normandy, and John lost the French possessions. Yeah, comment?
I was just going to say that certainly that didn't happen without a fight.
It was a kind of pitiful fight. I mean, Philip Augustus was very powerful by that time, and remember, he didn't waste his time and resources fighting crusades. He just put in that cameo appearance and zipped back home, and he had a very strong army, and he went in and he took over Normandy. The thing is that the barons the the families, by this time, the families in England, the Anglo-Norman families had been separated so that different branches were in control in England and in Normandy. And so it wasn't like he was taking land away from all the English barons, but some of them he did take land away from them. And so he sent in that army really quickly and took over Normandy, and John just couldn't do a thing. And so the barons in England were just furious. They were very angry at John because he lost Normandy, and especially, but the other possessions in France as well. And then to make things worse, Innocent III, seeing John's weakness and seeing that he wasn't a very good politician, or I don't know if he wasn't very smart or very capable, but he just made so many mistakes. And so Innocent then demanded that John do homage to him for England and said, "I am your lord," and John did it. And so the barons were very, very angry at him for that, which is exactly why they rebelled and wrote Magna Carta, that put the king under the law, was so that English kings could not go against the advice of the barons ever again and give England away to a lord like that, or lose all the lands without the barons' permission, because the barons felt that John had really wronged them. But what it ends up with is that Innocent III had really humiliated John after Philip Augustus had humiliated John. And Innocent III at this point was really lord of the world. He was incredibly powerful. And there's a child on the throne in Germany, and he's in control of England. The French were very smart when they dealt with the popes. The French never directly opposed the popes. They kind of went along, and they never challenged the papal power. And they did this very quietly, building their power, and until the time came when they wanted to seize the papacy, and then they did it because they were powerful enough to. And it was Philip the Fair who actually did it. But the French sort of, acted like they were going along with Innocent III, and the French kings got along with the powerful popes. So Innocent III thought of himself as Lord of the world, and then he called the Albigensian Crusade. Okay, now we're going to look at events in southern France and see if he's justified in doing this. The triggering event was the murder of Peter of Castelnau, the papal legate to southern France. And here we're going to look at southern France. We're going to look at the lands that we're talking about. These are the lands that essentially John lost to, or this is France. This is France, the whole area of France after John had lost the lands to the King of France. This is the area of southern France. At this time, southern France and northern France were two entirely different cultures. It was as if they were two different countries, politically as well as culturally. They were just very different. Here are the lands. Here is the kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily. Okay, and let's look a little bit closer at southern France and northern France. This is all the area that Philip Augustus actually ruled, and this is the area that shares the southern French culture, and we'll look at that southern French culture. And also it's shared by the Spanish. It's a culture that's shared between southern France. The Pyrenees are not a border here. They're not blocking this culture, because Spanish culture also takes part in that culture of southern France. Okay, and here are the main towns that the that in which this takes place. Did I skip a page? No. Here, that the headquarters of the Albigensian Crusade, Albi here, and the Albigensian Crusade is named after the city of Albi, and Toulouse is one of the main headquarters of the whole area. And we'll come back to this map again as we look at southern France. The real antecedents of the Albigensian Crusade are economic, political, culture, and religious. Popular heresies had become rooted more widely and deeply in the Midi, that's southern France, than in other regions of Europe. The institutions of church and state were not so effectively organized in that area of Languedoc as elsewhere. We call it Languedoc because there are essentially two languages, two major languages spoken in France at this time. And let's go back to this map again. The language that's spoken in northern France is called Languedoc because there the word for yes is oui, and so it's Languedoc. And in southern France, it's Languedoc because the word for yes is oc. And so they speak different languages is the bottom line here, but they have entirely different cultures. The feudal bond was weaker in the south than in other parts of France. The church was not very well organized. It was very tightly organized in the north, but very, very loosely organized in the south. The feudal bond was weaker than in other parts of France. And in the south, we can say, was it feudalism at all? Because one thing that distinguishes feudalism is the lord or the lord king owns all the lands or holds all the lands. And in southern France, local people own their own land, and that's called allodial lands. And the allodial lands, which are owned by local people, are the most common. The counts of Toulouse, who are the main ones there, paid only a shadowy allegiance to the King of France. And also, the kings of England and Aragon in Spain held substantial tracts in the region. The Emperor of Germany held suzerainty over Provence, east of the Rhine, and thus the counts of Toulouse owed allegiance to as many as 4 rulers for parts of their domain. And let's just flip back to our map one more time here. This is the area of Provence here, and it's essentially southern Burgundy, and all of Burgundy owes its allegiance to the Emperor of Germany. The King of Aragon holds some title to some of these lands right by the Pyrenees. Gascony and large areas here and areas up here owe allegiance to England. So there are all these different kings that have claims to southern France. And the counts of Toulouse might owe allegiance to many different rulers. And although their lands were substantial, they lacked cohesion. There were Roman roots of the culture of southern France versus the northern. And in fact, you can even talk about a culture of oil and wine in the south and butter and beer in the north. And so that you can talk about them being really different cultures as far as their food, their customs, much more Germanic in the north, more Roman in the south. The south was more urban than the north. The north was largely rural and organized as a feudal land. And the south was more urban and more into trading, especially with Spain and especially in the Mediterranean. There was a lot of interaction with the Catalans and Spain and the Muslims. Marseille, in fact, was the gateway to Mediterranean trade. Also, the south of France was the home of the courtly love tradition, and we talked a little bit about the courtly love that Eleanor of Aquitaine brought to England when she married Henry II of France. Her grandfather was William IX of Aquitaine, and he was supposedly the first troubadour poet. And he wrote some poetry, which I read you a bit of last time. And Bernard de Ventadorn was Eleanor's favorite troubadour, who she's supposed to have had him at her court, and there's a legend that she actually had an affair with him. And the popular heresy of Catharism did represent a serious challenge. And whether it rose out of this courtly love tradition of the South, or whether it rose from native elements or was imported from the East, it was clearly not Christian. I mean, when we look at it, you will see that it's not Christian. The Cathar heresy had become firmly rooted in northern Italy and Languedoc, where people thought of it as neo-Manichaeism, and largely they're sort of drawing on St. Augustine's Confessions and St. Augustine's little stint with Manichaeism for a while. Waldensian is another heresy that arose at the same time. But the roots of the Cathar heresy reach back to the Eastern Mediterranean and the earliest Christianity, and it's very similar to the Gnostic heresy that was really widespread in 2nd century Rome when Christianity first began. The Gnostic heresy is the closest to this heresy, and people think it survived in the East and that it came along the trade routes and was picked up again in southern France, where actual missionaries went to southern France to convert the southern French to this Gnostic Christian heresy. The Cathars were the pure, and they were either absolute or modified dualists. Absolute dualists believed in two principles or gods. They believed that there were two gods, that the world was divided into good and evil, and that a good God and an evil God both ruled the world, and they may have been in a struggle with each other. There are different varieties. Here are some scenes of courtly love, which is the culture of the South, which is a kind of perversion of feudalism, where often it's a kind of courtly love in which young bachelor knights fall in love with married women. It's always between a bachelor knight and a married woman, and the married woman is the epitome of womanly virtue and purity and gentleness and goodness and mercy and kindness, and all the good qualities that are in the Virgin Mary are reflected in the individual married woman as a mother and as a wife. And the young bachelors fall hopelessly in love with these married women who become the object of their desire and adoration, but the relationship is never consummated. I mean, they just love from a distance, and so they never gain the object of their love, but they are ennobled by her glance or by her friendliness or just her bestowing of a handkerchief or a token or anything on them. And it's a reverse kind of feudalism, where the woman then takes the role of the feudal lord and the bachelor knight does homage to her. There are actual pictures of the knight doing that. And so it's kind of a perversion of feudalism. It's something that would never happen in the North. And of course, poetry and songs that are sung to amour is something Southern. It wouldn't happen in the North. Here's this sort of soft country of the South. Here's Périgueux, part of this southern countryside, and it's a beautiful watercolor. Here is another view of a southern city. This is Carcassonne, which is a very large city for the South, and nothing like that existed in the north of France. And here is the amphitheater at Arles, which is built inside, as you can see, a Roman Colosseum. And so Roman ruins just permeate the entire south. And there's nothing like that in the north of France. Here is a triumphal arch in Orange that you find in the south that you wouldn't find in the north. Okay, the absolutist kind of dualism that was practiced. Some people think courtly love was a perversion of Christianity, and it led to acceptance of this heresy. The absolutist gods of the dualism were one God was wholly good, and this good God was immaterial and part of the suprasensible world, part of the spiritual world, and had no material qualities at all. The other God who confronted the good God was wholly evil, and he was the one who created the material world. So what does that mean in terms of their belief? Okay, what do they believe? Yeah, Travis.
Sounds like the things that they saw and were around them were all from evil, because the evil God created the material world.
Yeah, so this means the world is evil, doesn't it? It means the world is evil. It means that human beings are evil, because human beings are made of material flesh and blood. And it means that the created world is evil. Okay, only spiritual things are good. Now, modified dualists changed this a little bit. They thought that all creation was by God, and that Lucifer was a fallen angel who was given dominion over the material world, and he was cast out of heaven with the angels seduced by him. But nevertheless, whether they were modified dualists or absolute dualists, they were at one in believing that this world was from the devil and that all matter is evil. Okay, now think about that a minute. What does that do to Christianity? If all matter is evil, if human beings or human bodies, the created world is evil, what does that do to Christianity? Yeah. Matthew.
It means that Christianity, Roman Catholicism, is evil in a way.
Oh, what way? What way does it make Roman Catholicism evil?
They make a big deal out of things like relics and material, tangible objects. Granted, they're objects that are relating to saints and to the true cross, etc. However, they're material objects, and material objects are evil.
Okay, so all those things are out the window immediately. Yeah. What about you, Travis? What do you think?
It also it places a big question mark on created in the image of God.
Ah, good. Okay. Are we created in the image of God? If God is a spirit, he has no image, right? Yeah. Okay, what does this do to Christ?
It makes him evil because he was flesh and blood, physical, human form.
Oh, but he's God. I mean, they think they're Christians, and so they think Christ is God. They think he never took human form. They think that Christ was purely spiritual, that he never took human form. And this is the opposite of the development Christianity has been taking, as we saw it especially in northern France, in that area. It also means that it means human beings are made of matter, and God is all spirit, and so we're not godlike. And you're absolutely right that it takes the humanity. I mean, it takes the humaneness, the humanism out of Christianity. I mean, humanism comes from the idea that men are created in God's image and that God took on human form, and that the world is good. That material things are good. And so this denies all of those things. So they believe all matter is evil, and they believe that the souls of angels who fell from heaven were forcibly implanted in the bodies of men by the devil. So the body is evil. And the problem of salvation, therefore, is to free the soul from the envelope in which it is imprisoned. So the material body is just an envelope that holds the souls. The body is not holy in itself, as Christianity believes, because Christianity holds the body as sacred. Okay? Both groups, whether they're absolutists or modified dualists, denied the Trinity. You have to deny the Trinity. Jesus and the Holy Ghost were created and therefore inferior to God. Okay, so now it's no longer a monotheistic religion, right? If you're going to have Jesus and the Holy Ghost both being inferior to God, then you don't have, you have three gods. You don't have a monotheistic religion. They also believe that Christ had no real existence on earth, that he was only a phantom and not truly born, and this, of course, denies the dignity of human being. They believe Christ did not eat, did not suffer, did not rise from the dead, did not ascend to heaven. And so, don't you see this as clearly a heresy? Clearly a heresy, yeah. And it gets worse than that. I didn't stick it in the notes, but they also believed that there were two gods, and that the evil God was the Old Testament God who created the world, Yahweh, and that he is the epitome of all evil, and that the New Testament God is the epitome of good and spirit. And so this also denies one of the major points of Christianity, and that anyway, it really is quite a heresy. They also believe that the sacraments or ceremony of the church are unavailing, that the clergy possess no special powers, and that there's no purgatory and no resurrection of the body. They denied the validity of prayers and offerings for the dead. They spurned the veneration of the cross, images, and relics. Belief in the special sanctity of churches and altars are taken to be void of meaning, that not even buildings, of course, are material, And so churches are not sacred, altars are not sacred. They refused to take any oaths, and they denied the right of justice to the civil power. That means that they said that the courts of their lords, whoever they might be, cannot render justice, and so they denied the justice of their superiors. They condemned marriage, that marriage was a bad thing because it involved material bodies, and they condemned procreation. The idea was you're not supposed to bear any children. You're not supposed to have any children. They refused to eat meat, milk, or eggs because all of those things were of sexual origin. Okay, this is quite a bizarre sect in many ways. In place of the church, they were in the process of setting up a rival church with a hierarchy. And the church they were setting up had bishops, and it also and they called these bishops elder sons, and they had younger sons, which were like deacons in the Christian church. They did recognize a few sacraments which they identified as their own sacraments. The consolamentum was the key sacrament, and this was usually it was like a confession. It was like a baptism, and it was sort of like an ordination. And usually it took place with most people maybe at their death. They had a liturgy, and they called people who had gone through the consolamentum the perfecti. And these were very spiritual people who could live by a very strict code, giving up marriage, giving up all pleasure, giving up all things of the material type, who could live these very pure lives. And those who had not yet reached that level of perfection were called the credentes, or the believers. The core of the membership of this new church they were forming were the perfecti, and there were about 4,000 of them in the 13th century. And they went through a long and rigorous novitiate, at the end of which they went through the consolamentum, which was somewhat comparable to baptism and ordination. The baptism, however, was spiritual and not material, so they didn't sprinkle them with water or oil or anything like that, because those are material things, so it had to be completely spiritual. And this spiritual consolamentum cleansed them from sin, and once they went through it, they were qualified to preach and perform rituals. And once they had reached the state of perfecti, they had to live a life of great austerity. But this was the only path that you could follow in order to be freed, to have your soul freed to return to heaven. This is the only path to heaven. This means that not very many people go to heaven, doesn't it? Only the people who could live this very rigorous life, go through the training, go through the consolamentum, and then live a very austere life at the end, could know that at their death their soul was freed to return to heaven. Most people delayed the consolamentum until they felt that death was approaching, and they would be baptized, or they would go through it on their deathbed. Okay, so this religion was considered destructive, not just of the Orthodox religious faith, but of social and political institutions as well. The problem with this is, the problem with me reading you all of this stuff is that not very many of the Cathar documents survive because the church burned them. And so all we know is what the church recorded in the documents of the Inquisition. Okay, so that we're sort of reading these beliefs through the ones who tried to destroy and eliminate this religion. But clearly it's heretical. I mean, even if this is extreme, clearly these beliefs are heretical. As early as 1145, St. Bernard of Clairvaux led a mission to Occitania, which is another name for this region, Occitania. It's called Languedoc. It's also called Occitania. It means the whole region of southern France. Missions were sent into Occitania as if it were a foreign land for the next 60 years. And in 1178, a papal legate secured the condemnation of Pierre Morand, a rich merchant of Toulouse. Pierre then turned around and abjured Catharism, and as a penance he spent 3 years in the Holy Land. But when he returned to Toulouse, the people of Toulouse elected him to the city council. And so, I mean, they were all heretics too, so, you know, one must question, did he really recant or not? In 1205, a Cistercian mission was joined by 2 Spaniards, and these Spaniards were the founders of the Dominicans. St. Dominic became the chief preacher, and he founded the whole order of the Dominicans in order to preach the Albigensian Crusade, to preach against Albigensianism. And so this was the mission of the Dominican friars, to preach in the cities of southern France, and this is how they all began. The Dominicans would go into the cities of southern France, and remember there are lots of cities there, and they would have formal debates in the middle of town or on street corners, and they would debate the merits of this religion. But the great missionary effort of 1203 to 7 was a failure. And so Pope Alexander III, who was Pope from 1159 to 81, suggested using armed force to wipe the Cathars out. It was a rather half-hearted suggestion, and Pope Alexander III was distracted by other issues, so he never really sent a crusade into southern France, but Innocent then took it up. So we go all the way back to St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and what approximately was his date? You all remember? The 1140s, the Second Crusade. He preached the Second Crusade, and here is his seal, St. Bernard, and here he is preaching the Second Crusade. So as early as that, missionaries were going in and preaching against the Cathars. Innocent III, 1198 to 1216, was more willing to carry out the crusade, and he more clearly linked it with other crusades. He saw it as part of a whole movement against not only the Muslims in the Holy Land, but also pagans in the north and infidels, I guess you'd call them heretics, in southern France. So he's a broadening of the idea of crusading. And it was easy to resort to force because they had already sanctified violence. Violence was a holy thing now. Knighthood was what had become holy with the Templar movements and the other military orders. And so the Albigensian Crusade then became the first large-scale use of the crusade inside of Europe itself to obtain the objectives of the papacy. In 1204 to 1205, Innocent III began to threaten invasion, and what he did was to turn to the strongest ruler in all of Europe, which was Philip Augustus. And Philip Augustus had just grabbed all that land away from the English, and he was solidly ensconced in northern France. He had good control. He's the first king to really have firm control of all of that area of northern France. And so Innocent turned to him, and the French had always been a friend to the papacy, and asked Philip Augustus to lead a full-fledged crusade. He tempted him with the prospect of acquiring the lands of the heretics. And Philip didn't like this because it went against the rules of feudalism, okay? To take away, to just make war on people and seize their lands. If people are heretics, their land should be forfeit to their feudal lord according to the rules of feudalism. And so Philip Augustus didn't really understand that the rules of feudalism were not in place in southern France. He thought of the whole world as feudal, so he didn't really understand how different it was. Also, he had just conquered Normandy and Anjou from King John, and he was kind of distracted with trying to hold that in place while he could. And here is Philip Augustus. Here's his seal. We've seen him before. Here we can see the lands of the Angevin Empire that were controlled by Richard and his father, Henry II. This is the Angevin Empire. And here is John. Here is bad King John. He's called John Sans Terre, John without land, because he was the youngest son. Nobody thought he would inherit, but he did. And here he is. He's almost in Roman garb in this seal. This is quite extraordinary here in the seal of John. But here is England now in red, and here is France that Philip Augustus now controlled. And here, of course, is southern France, which is the topic of our Catharism. Oh, Catharism was as rife in northern Italy as it was in southern France, but there Innocent had to temporize because of the Germans. The liberties of the Italian cities that were strong papal supporters were able to be quelled by peaceful means because the popes had much more support, because the Italian cities needed that papal support to keep the Germans out of there. And so the popes supported the cities, and the cities supported the popes, and so together they quelled the heretics by peaceful means. And could this have been done in southern France as well? Probably not, because the Pope didn't have that much influence in southern France. Southern France was far too independent. But maybe if the popes had approached it differently, but we'll see. The Mendicant orders, and that means the Dominicans and the Franciscans, although it was mostly the Dominicans who did the preaching in France. The Franciscans preached in Italy. But the Dominicans and the Inquisition were far more effective than the Crusade, but Innocent III was impatient, and in 1207, when the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau was excommunicated, Raymond VI of Toulouse placed his, in 1207, the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau excommunicated Raymond VI of Toulouse, and he placed his lands under interdict because Raymond of Toulouse had been protecting heretics. But most European rulers had been excommunicated, including King John and Philip Augustus, so that excommunication wasn't that big a deal anymore. Nobody cared. So still, at that point, maybe they wouldn't have had to be made war on. Here is the seal of Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, who was excommunicated for supporting heretics. Raymond tried to play the game, but Innocent was in no mood to compromise. In 2 conferences with papal legates, Raymond made no real concessions. He would promise anything, but he would actually do nothing. In 1208, Pierre de Castelnau was assassinated, probably without Raymond's knowledge. But contemporaries believed Raymond was behind it, so he was blamed for that assassination. Innocent then renewed the appeal to Philip Augustus and the barons of France, and the nobility was aroused. Philip Augustus was very smart, and he knew not to get bogged down in a crusade when he was still stabilizing his power in northern France. Philip Augustus was cautious, and he tried to limit the size of the forces, but his barons thought this was a good idea. Now, why would they think it's a good idea? Obviously, greed. One thing they would get is all the lands they conquered. And so Philip Augustus, sort of tried to hold them back. And Philip Augustus also reminded Innocent that the Pope had no right to the fiefs of the King of France. So even though Innocent was saying, well, why don't you just conquer southern France? He was really asserting his own right to rule southern France, even though he had no actual control over it. And that was how a lot of the French kings actually built their power. They took their theoretical power and just stood their ground and said, this is the power I have. But there was a huge response in France, and the reason is because they saw the crusade as a just cause, that the vows were very easy to fulfill. They didn't have to go all the way to the Holy Land and risk drowning or risk kidnapping or being murdered along the way. They just had to make a short journey to southern France. That appealed to them. And also, according to the rules of feudalism, when knights were called up to go to war for their feudal lord, they only had to serve for 40 days. And so they wouldn't have to commit themselves to journeys that took 4 or 5 or 6 years to the Holy Land, but they could just go a little ways to southern France, put in their 40-day service, and go back home. Okay, so this was very appealing. They could take on the whole crusading thing and do everything that they were required to do as crusaders, but with very little effort. And it also promised great rewards. In the Holy Land, stories had come back. People got killed. Bad things happened in the Holy Land. But here, they had a much better chance of just grabbing lands that were closer to home. And here are the sergeants at arms to Philip Augustus, and these would have been the ones who would go off to the crusade and be ready to fight. This is a monk, obviously. Okay. They only had to serve their 40 days to receive the rewards, and so what happened was you had all these soldiers going to fight the crusade in southern France, and their size fluctuated, and they came in wave after wave after wave, and they only had to serve 40 days, and they went home. And sometimes they didn't even fight any battles because they only had to serve for 40 days. And so think about having an army like that where constantly men were flowing back and forth and the personnel were changing constantly. I mean, it would take a brilliant commander to win any battles with that kind of an army, right? It's a virtually impossible army to control. Colin Powell would have had nightmares to have an army like that. The journey to southern France was inexpensive and safe, and real bloody conflicts were actually quite rare. And so it was not very dangerous, and the rewards were great. Thus, wave after wave of crusaders pulsed southward, but an extreme lack of organization. The nominal leader was Arnaud Amore of Citeaux, the papal legate, who was a monk. Okay, a monk was supposed to be a papal legate and was the leader of this thing. Okay, think of this completely fluid army commanded by a monk. They didn't have a chance in hell of, of conquering anything. The highest ranking layman was the Duke of Burgundy, the Counts of Nevers, and St. Pol and Boulogne, but none of these lay leaders had the tenacity or military skill needed. But one great leader emerged, and this was Simon de Montfort, okay, the great hero of the crusade. He had, his greatest quality was the ability to build an effective army out of these shifting groups of men, and he was really a military genius and also a genius as a leader of men. He was very talented. These shifting groups of men from all parts of France, and also there were mercenaries of doubtful dependability, so he could manage all these men, and he was also a superb field commander. And here is the famous Simon de Montfort, and mounted on his horse and going into battle. Okay, I have a book on his son, Simon de Montfort, and this is a picture of the son, Simon de Montfort, by J.R. Madicott, who does a little bit at the beginning describing the father, Simon de Montfort. The son, Simon de Montfort, does anybody know what the son of Simon de Montfort did or what he's famous for? When the barons in England rebelled against King John, when they wrote Magna Carta and they seized the kingdom from John, the son, Simon de Montfort, then was the leader they elected of that government. So it kind of ran in the family. That's who this book is about. This book is about the Simon de Montfort who led England when they deposed King John briefly and all around Magna Carta. Okay, but this is his father, Simon de Montfort, who led the crusade. We heard about him before. Where have we heard of this Simon de Montfort before? Anybody remember? We heard about him last week.
Didn't he take part in one of the earlier crusades?
Which one? Fourth, yeah. Yeah, the Fourth Crusade. Remember, he was the leader. He and the Cistercians objected to conquering Zara, and they also objected to conquering Constantinople. So he's kind of a fine, upstanding, moral kind of person, you know, as opposed to all the other knights. Well, the lack of unity of the Crusaders was mirrored in the lack of unity among the Aquitanians, all the southern French. We call them Aquitanians. It's a label we can put on everybody in southern France because each of the different territories have different names. A united South could have negotiated a settlement and made the war costly to the north, but the lords of Aquitania could not agree on anything for the first 2 years. They were completely disunified. And so Simon de Montfort, even though he had a disunified army, he was able to organize it because his enemy, he had the advantage of his enemy also being not unified and being, completely operating in their own territories. The first campaign was against Béziers and Carcassonne. And in June 1209, Raymond of Toulouse submitted and placed 12 castles in the hand of the church. The legate, Milo, we have a new legate, of course, because Pierre of Castelnau had been assassinated, so the new legate is Milo. He restored Raymond of Toulouse to the church, and the next day Raymond took the cross. The crusading army left Lyon on the 24th of June and arrived at the Catholic city of Montpellier. The target was now Béziers, where the count was Raymond Roger, who ruled from really strong strongholds. And I have some pictures of here's Béziers, and here is the castle. There's the church, and the castle all around it is fortified by walls, and it's a really strong city in Béziers. And here is the money of Raymond Roger. He's a Vicomte of Béziers. I don't have a picture of him, but this is the coins that he issued. Béziers was captured, one of the most pitiless massacres of the Middle Ages. The whole city was massacred. No one was spared, Catholics and heretics, men and women, clerics and children. A Southern chronicler believed it was a deliberate act of policy, Make an example of Béziers, slaughter everyone, and all the other cities will surrender. At least one chronicler accused the Northern Crusaders of that. But probably that's not true, because most of the killing was done by foot soldiers, camp followers, and mercenaries. And people, the lower class people who were out there to get whatever they could. Nevertheless, it gave the crusade a quick initial success that it needed, and the city of Tronqueval immediately surrendered, and because they didn't want to be massacred, and then dozens of local lords submitted and gained the protection of the church. Raymond Roger and his men were able to spare Carcassonne the fate of Béziers, but all inhabitants had to depart, because of this massacre of the first city. Most of the other cities surrendered. This is the bishop of Carcassonne who is surrendering. And here are the cities. If we can look at where they came from, they actually traveled down the road and they launched their attack. They gathered at Lyon, which is right here, and they traveled down the Rhone River over this way, and then they attacked Béziers first and then moved toward Carcassonne. And so that was the course of the campaign. And here is the gate of Aude at Carcassonne, and so we can see what a stronghold the city of Carcassonne is. They gave up the city of Carcassonne, and all the inhabitants had to leave it. All their property was seized as booty, but there was to be no killing. These were the terms of the surrender. Even the heretics were allowed to depart in peace. Raymond Roger was the archetype of the Aquitanian prince who was technically a Catholic, but nevertheless he protected and encouraged heresy. And once he had surrendered, he was made an object lesson. They took away all his lands and they gave it to a true Catholic, a Frenchman. And Raymond Roger was put into prison, and there he stayed until his death. It's likely that Philip Augustus was opposed to increasing the strength of the great lords who were leading this crusades, like the Duke of Burgundy or the Counts of Nevers and St. Pol. The choice of the new lords of Béziers was Simon de Montfort, who was a relatively weak baron in France. He was actually not powerful enough to cause any jealousy, so everybody could agree on him as a leader. He had already shown his bravery and loyalty to the church, and he actually was not a huge landholder back in France, so he wouldn't be a danger to the crown. During the Fourth Crusade, he had been one of the few crusaders to refuse to attack Zara, And Simon de Montfort turned out to be exactly the right man for the job. He was both ambitious and realistic, and he knew most of the army would soon go home, and so he took account of that and prepared for it. He needed a solid base in Béziers and the Carcassonne area, and it was needed to conquer the Tronqueville lands. He made the leaders of the crusade swear to come to his aid if needed. After a futile assault on Cabaret, the Count of Nevers and the Duke of Burgundy departed. In the winter of 1209 to 1210, Limoux and Albi surrendered without resistance, and the lesser towns also surrendered. Okay, and essentially this is in this area right up here. They were in Toulouse, Carcassonne. Toulouse has surrendered by now. They've got Carcassonne, they've got Béziers, and Toulouse has surrendered, and so now they're moving up into this area where Albi is, and so they're moving up that way. Okay, and here is the Cathedral of Albi, which they had now taken. Okay. Raymond Roger died in prison of natural causes, so he spent his whole life there and died in prison. Simon bought the rights of Raymond Roger's widow and infant son to the Viscounty, and he became the Viscount of Raymond Roger's lands. As time passed, so did fear, and the lords and the towns revolted against Simon. His most trusted companions were killed and imprisoned, and Peter of Aragon refused to accept Simon's homage. Okay, Peter of Aragon was the lord of the property that Simon had taken over, and his lord Peter of Aragon refused to accept Simon's homage. The Count of Foix became openly hostile and took back his castles, and there was rebellion everywhere. Simon's small army was ineffective, and I was going to read Simon's letter to the Pope. I hope I've got the right book here. Okay. Okay, here's the letter that Simon wrote to the Pope. The lords who took part in the crusade have left me almost alone, surrounded by the enemies of Jesus Christ who occupy the mountains and the hills. I cannot govern this land any longer without your help and that of the faithful. The country has been impoverished by the ravages of war. The heretics have destroyed or abandoned some of their castles, but they have kept others which are stronger and which they intend to defend. I must pay the troops that remain with me at a much higher rate than I would in other wars. I have been able to keep a few soldiers, but only by doubling their wages. Okay, Simon was saved by his own qualities of courage, tenacity, and ability to make quick decisions, and by the devotion of his companions. Most of his companions came from Montfort, the Vexin, the Ile-de-France, and so they were his friends from back home who really allowed him to keep control there. The rebellion also was not coordinated. Raymond of Toulouse was still dealing with the Pope, and the legates and the lesser lords were all fighting for their own little districts. Again, they were completely disunified. They couldn't cooperate. And the area that he came from, that Simon de Montfort came from, is right here between Normandy and the city of Paris. This is the Vexin, and he's a border lord in that area, if you can see it there, between Paris and the border of Normandy, and that's where all of those lords who were his friends came from. Simon was able, with their help, to hold out until spring. And in spring, his wife, Alice de Montfort, arrived with reinforcements. Weren't you surprised at the role that Alice took in this, that she really took a large part in this crusade? She arrived with reinforcements, only a few, but enough to turn the tide. And by December, Simon had broken the back of the rebellion. He was aided by successive waves of crusaders, and he began with a deliberate act of terror. He took the castle of Bram, and there Simon hanged his own treasonous clerk, and he blinded and cut off the noses and upper lips of the whole garrison of Bram, which had rebelled against him. Only one man was left with one eye to guide them all back to Cabaret. Simon was following the examples of Richard Lionheart and Philip Augustus, and whereas the first massacre of Béziers was just kind of an accident, now he's using terror and slaughter as a policy. But Simon was much more gentle in the next castles over the next few months. His action was a warning and was taken as such. Simon then reoccupied the lost castles in the spring and summer of 1210. He took Minerva on 22 July and Termes, which held out until 22 November. He let the Catholics and the simple heretics go, but the perfecti had to choose between abjuring their faith or death by fire. And in fact, only 3 women saved themselves by renouncing their faith, and 140 of the perfecti were burned to death. Then a simple military promenade brought promises of obedience from the northern towns, the northerly towns toward the north. Albi was helped by the political skill of its own bishops, and as a lord of the town, the bishop protected his people. The heretics themselves migrated south. It was the Inquisition, not the Crusades, that ended heresy in the Albigeois. Okay, now we move to the next phase in the war, the entrapment of Raymond VI. In 1211, Simon's legacy became recognized. The southern lords of the southern area did fealty to him, and he gave his companions fiefs, and they founded families. They either brought their wives from the north or they married local women. Raymond VI of Toulouse controlled a large part of Aquitania, and now the church believed that the heresy could not be rooted out until Raymond was ousted. Simon took the offensive against Raymond, and the legates excommunicated Raymond once again. Innocent III refused his pleas for forgiveness. Other people had been excommunicated, and they just sort of made a deal, and so that the Pope would raise that excommunication, but he didn't. He would not make a deal with Raymond. All of these people negotiated with Raymond and gave him hope of saving himself and his county, but they wouldn't sort of finalize it. He was accused of not persecuting the heretics enough, but all his people were heretics. How could he persecute? How could he persecute everybody in his town, all the citizens of his town? Who wants a depopulated county? I mean, what was he supposed to do? Kill all his people? They were all heretics. So Raymond did penance at St. Giles and promised to suppress the heretics, but unfortunately for Raymond, he became a symbol for the protection of heresy. In fact, the papacy had set out to make an example of him, and that would be to try to, if you make an example of one guy, then maybe all the other lords will give up. The churchmen tried to prevent him from clearing himself, to keep him as a symbol, and he appealed to Philip Augustus in Paris as a loyal supporter. In fact, he appealed to Philip Augustus as his feudal lord. But interestingly, Philip backed off from this feudal lord business, and he didn't want to become involved. Raymond then went to Rome to see the Pope, and Innocent listened but would not reverse the policy of the legates. Raymond then sought a direct audience with Simon. He was supported by Peter II of Aragon, Raymond's brother-in-law, because Raymond was married to Peter of Aragon's sister. Peter had finally accepted Simon's homage for Carcassonne. At this point, Peter arranged some marriages. He arranged to have one of his sisters marry Raymond's son, and to have Peter's son marry Simon's daughter. But the efforts for pacification were useless. Simon reached no agreement with Raymond, and the legates would not permit any compromise. They gave an ultimatum to Raymond to disarm his county, allow Simon to drive the heretics out, and go on crusade. Raymond was to retain the title of Count of Toulouse, but Simon was to be given the real power. Raymond, of course, refused, and Peter of Aragon was offended. The legates had, in fact, won. Raymond was excommunicated again on the 6th of February, 1211. Okay, here is Peter of Aragon, and with a kind of portrait on this coin. And here is the money of Raymond Roger, again, Vicomte of Béziers, who had died. Okay, this arrangement was confirmed on the 17th of April, and the legates were ordered to seize Raymond's lands. Simon attacked Cabaret and Lavar, and the city council of Toulouse decided what to do. The Bishop of Toulouse, Fulk of Marseille, who was a former troubadour, interestingly, joined the siege. Cabaret fell easily, and Lavar held out until May, but the fall of Lavar was marked by acts of terror. The commander of the garrison, Amaury of Montreal, had twice sworn oaths to Simon and twice betrayed him. So Simon hanged him, and 80 knights were executed. Geralda, the lady of the castle, was murdered and thrown into a well and stoned to death. She was a Cathar, but known for her charity. So again, atrocities are committed. And this is Fulk, the Bishop of Toulouse, who tried to save the city. 400 perfecti were burned, one of the largest mass executions of the Crusades. The Cathar leaders ceased taking refuge in the fortified cities, and thus the Cathar church was not weakened, but dozens of towns and castles around Toulouse surrendered to Simon. Okay, now Simon decided to try a direct attack on Toulouse, urged by Arnaud Amaury. We're going to go ahead and take our break now with Simon attacking Toulouse, and when we come back, we'll see how he completes the war. Okay.